What we're going to do is talk about SRM and how to be successful. Actually, I'm going to start on a slightly different topic. I found this up here. Somebody's trying to do some marketing, and there's a session, BC6703-How. It's called Intelligent HA, Application Awareness with VMware HA. A friend of mine works on that, and I'm just going to mention it because it's one of those things that's too good to be true, except it's true. HA is something that we call high availability, and it means when an ESX host dies, thanks to HA, all the VMs on that host will be started on another host. I think most of us will know about that. We have a third-party API for HA that we haven't told many people about, but Symantec has learned about that API, and they can now, with their software, talk to that API. So as a simple example, instead of waiting for an ESX host to die and then HA restarting the VMs on another host, you could have an application die and restart it. Or you could say not die, but an application slow down, or a particular service. I don't mean a service, I mean the service that the application provides. If that's negatively impacted, restart it somewhere else. So this is something not a lot of people have talked about, and there's one single session on it. But I've seen it work. One of my coworkers on the team that we're on, he loves this stuff, and he demonstrates it, and it's pretty darn spiffy, so I recommend it. But moving right along. Disclaimer, we've all seen that a lot of times. This is our agenda, what we're going to work through in the next 65 minutes, I guess. I'm starting early. There's a number of things in here that come from hard experience of me sitting in front of a customer and making things work, or quite frankly, not working. There's a record. A friend of mine who's a professional services consultant in Canada, he had a project delay by about 4 or 5 weeks. And incidentally, I think our PSO guys get $2,200 a day. Is that right? $1,000 a day? I don't know. 4 weeks of a great deal of money per day is what that customer had to pay because something didn't work. Because, a little bit funny, but they didn't have this presentation. And so that's one of the kind of things that you can save when you learn what's in here. You need to worry about storage, and not because of what you might think, but because of something else we'll talk about. So we're going to cover off some things up there that will help you be successful. But then there's little things, because I like little things, like naming. We have a log file with SRM that has storage stuff in it, has VMware stuff in it, has ESX stuff in it, has SRM stuff in it. So it can be really confusing. And of course, if you think about the naming, and I have some examples, then in that log file, you'll actually be able to more quickly see and understand what you're looking at, because you know, as an example, the LUN name is very similar to the data store name, and thus when SRM reports it, it'll actually make more sense. So we'll go through a bunch of things there. And then I have some links, and why don't we just take a look at it. This is the typical slide. This is one of the few that I didn't create, and thus it looks very, very nice. This is the slide that describes Site Recovery Manager. I'm hoping most of us have an idea about Site Recovery Manager. There's a couple of things on here, though, that I think are particularly important. Starting right here, simplified and automated setup, failover, and testing. You notice my order's a little different than theirs. Testing is something that a lot of people don't quite understand how powerful it is. I'm an ex-soldier, and sometimes before we did things, we practiced over and over and over again. It's been 15 years or something since I jumped out of an airplane or picked up a rifle, but there's a lot of things I still know because it's in my muscles. It's in my muscle memory. Well, guess what? That's just like SRM, because you're able to test over and over and over again how to bring Exchange back in a crisis. That means when the time comes and you're actually at Disneyland, because let's face it, that's what happens. You practice, then you're at Disneyland, and somebody else pushes the button, it's going to have behind that button everything that you did. All of that testing is going to mean everything works. So the fact that SRM does the failover is great. That's why you pay for it. but really being able to test over and over and over again and use realistic, what I call enhanced testing, where you're testing the sending and receiving of email. You're testing going into Oracle and processing a check. It really means in a disaster things work better. A couple other things, though, that I really like. Manual recovery runbooks. Many of you probably have a form of disaster recovery right now. Maybe a bunch of scripts. Maybe you're like EMC and you have big blue binders. One of their data centers in Toronto has 3 big, huge binders about that thick that have all the steps they go through, one check mark at a time, to recover the data center. Well, it means when they went to SRM in that data center, it was a very straightforward project. There was not much excitement at all because they took their manual recovery runbooks, and that was the information that they put into Site Recovery Manager to produce the recovery plan. Another thing I like on this slide is this third point here. I like very much the ability for me to go to one place, Virtual Center. I already know how to use it. And I can go to it and I can look at the history of every single test, every single real failover that you've ever done, and then I know, hey, these guys are good, I know what to do. Or, if you're new to Site Recovery Manager, and you go look at it the first time, well, it's going to look a little familiar to you already because it's in Virtual Center. So very handy, makes the learning a little quicker, I think. Here's the marketing thing that I can't help but smile when I can't really say it very well, but it's true. SRM does make disaster recovery rapid, reliable, and what's the last one? Affordable. It is actually true. If you think about it, it used to be on a per processor cost $1,700 per processor in an ESX host to protect the virtual machines on top of it. That's a very small cost in comparison to some of my past projects where you would have a whole bunch of servers in a data center somewhere that were turned off and just waiting to be turned on. So I think affordable is realistic. Here's the diagram I really like. This is Site Recovery Manager. It starts at the bottom. We have a storage array on our protected side. We have another one of the same type on the recovery side, and we have replication between them. If we don't have the replication, I got to be honest, do not buy Site Recovery Manager. Believe it or not, we've had partners sell Site Recovery Manager to people that do not have a storage array. And more importantly, don't have a second storage array. I guess so. VMware has been very successful, thanks to people like you guys, and the fact we deliver things that work. We don't have a system for giving refunds. I bet you 50 people had to work on that project to issue somebody a refund. It's just not good. But we start at the bottom. You need to have that storage. Although, to be honest, I have a talk tomorrow, I think, where we talk about the future of SRM. And in that, we have a very similar diagram. In fact, I used the same diagram, but I pulled out this stuff at the bottom. So very different in the future, but today, you have to have storage arrays on both sides, and they need to replicate. And then above, we can see our ESX host. Notice there are different numbers on each side. What you can't see here, but what you can just imagine, is on our protected side, we have those beautiful Nehalem processors that I am very fond of. And on the other side, we have our other processors from even, let's say, from AMD. And that's okay, because we are moving the virtual machines between the two sites using replication, so that means there's an outage. They're off, and that means when they are turned on again, if they happen to be turned on AMD, that's just fine. So that's a great way. Many of our customers have saved money by putting the older servers on the recovery side. And above that, we have Virtual Center in both places. We have to have Virtual Center and at least one ESX host running. And of course, that means licensed. And somebody here probably should be asking me, are you sure? Is there any way we can turn off that ESX host and not have it licensed? And then when we need it, then we license it. And the answer is really, really simple. No. Can't do that. It actually, literally, one ESX host has to be running. Now, since you asked, the fact is we have customers that are generally like hosting companies, and they actually do have one turned on, but then they have 10 or 20 or 50 that are turned off. And they're actually given to whomever needs them at the time of the recovery. And that's pretty spiffy, and that works, but there has to be one turned on. And of course, Virtual Center has to be working and licensed. And then we have SRM here, very interesting product. It has a database just like Virtual Center does. And notice we have SRM on both sides. And then we have this little thing, the SRM plugin. That means when you're in vSphere, if you want to see and work with SRM, you need to manage the plugins and pull the SRM plugin down. And this little orange, which I tried to make blood red, just to really make sure everybody understood where that fits into things, is the storage replication adapter. That's the magic piece of software that allows you to hit a green or a red button in Site Recovery Manager and not only have a whole bunch of VMware stuff happen, but a whole bunch of storage stuff happen. As an example, in a test failover, so we have some virtual machines running here, and they're in a test failing over to the other side. When you push the green button, we actually will we'll ask the storage through the SRA to take a snapshot or a clone, and we'll use it to do the test. And when we're finished, we'll say, hey, we're finished, and that clone will be gotten rid of. We'll put everything back the way it was. And yet, when you do the red button, and it's a real failover, at that time, we will break replication, and we will promote the storage array on the recovery side to be read-write, and then mount it with respect to Virtual Center and the ESX hosts and all of that. So all of that is possible with one button push, thanks to these SRAs. However, they're a major source of pain and suffering, and we're going to talk about them real soon.
Let's improve that.
Actually, we have a whole team. This fellow named Hari is responsible for that, and we are working on a few things. As an example, in our next major release, we'll take diagnostic information and the parent-level code or error codes, and we'll actually make them visible in SRM to try and make that a little easier. But they're doing a lot of other things very aggressively, I assure you. Here's a bit of an example. If anybody hasn't seen a recovery plan, this is actually a recovery plan. If you think about it, we can see up here steps. You might even see the numbers, or actually I can't, but I know where to point. There's numbers. We start at step 1, and we go as many steps as there are. If, as an example, you have 1,000 virtual machines, you'll have a bunch of steps at the beginning for preparing storage and things like that, and then you'll actually have 1,000 steps because you have 1,000 virtual machines to protect. We start at the top and we work our way through. One of the things we'll talk about is a little bit we'll talk about scalability. We can protect 1,000 virtual machines, but there's a way that you can protect them that takes a very long time to require to fail over. I would say 3 or 4 minutes times 1,000, or there's another way you can do it where it might take an hour or 45 minutes or something in comparison, because you can do some of this recovery stuff in more than one way, and I'll try and make sure you understand from a scalability point of view which way to do it. But this is the recovery plan right here where it says continue. We've reached the point in a test where you go to your employees or your coworkers and you say, yes, we're now ready for you to do your test. Log into Exchange or Oracle or SQL, do whatever it is you need to do to confirm that, excuse me, miss, no more, after this fellow, no more people, no, yes, you can come in, but no more. It's sort of distracting. So this is the time with that yellow box when you actually call somebody and say, okay, this is the time, everybody go test. When I do this with customers and proof of concepts, I'll sometimes have laptops in a cafeteria, the back wall, and that would be the time when we see this yellow box where we say, okay, people, when you're finished lunch, go sit at those laptops and try and write There's no chairs?
Well, right here.
Yeah, actually, there's one right here. You don't want the chair up here? Okay. So this is the point where people go out and do their tests. They prove that Exchange is working or Oracle's working or, whatever it is you're protecting. And then, when they're finished and call you back and say, we're done, we would actually just hit that continue button, and it would clean everything up. It would literally turn off the virtual machines and delete them. It would take that storage that's been snapshotted or cloned or whatever the right word is for your storage, and then it'll actually put that back. And everything will be back the way it was. You will be able to continue. You'll be able to continue and do another test, or you'll be able to just have everything back to normal. What I like to suggest is when you have SRM working, literally every single Friday for the first few months, you do a different test. You work through all the different applications that you're protecting, and you work all the different people through them. I've been at 10 different lost data center situations that I help customers recover from. Some of them I protected. And it was always the wrong person who was there. And it was always the person least likely to succeed. But by practice makes perfect. It was manual. We didn't have SRM in any of those cases. But I'm an ex-soldier. We practiced and practiced and practiced. We had drills. And even though it was the least likely, hey, we're closed, we're full. So you can sit on the floor and stay, or you can come back another time. But we really don't have, if these guys are leaving, we have chairs for you. So in any case, by practicing very regular, that means when there's a crisis, and don't forget, in fact, I think I have a slide to talk about, it's not always a bad thing. It's not always a bad storm that destroys your data center that you recover from. Sometimes it's really what you don't expect, and we'll talk about that. But practice makes perfect, and that is what we see here. We're practicing. Yes?
Is the testing done in isolation? So how do you get your app testers connected to that isolation?
So I'm not sure if everybody heard, but the gentleman was asking about, is the test done in a bubble? The answer to that part of the question is yes, because of course you're testing with the real production environment, the real Exchange, the real SQL, the real Oracle. So yes, it's in a test bubble. And the second part of the question is a real obvious one. If you're in an isolated test bubble, how do you actually get your test people into that? You remember how I mentioned in one case I have in the cafeteria, I have laptops against the far wall? They were on an isolated VLAN. And that isolated VLAN was connected to the ESX hosts in the test. And so when they went and sat at those laptops, they were able to log in with their current credentials and get into the applications. We actually, in the other building, we have we have a big self-paced lab. One of the labs I spent a bunch of time writing. It's the, I think they call it advanced now. But in it, we do an example of that. You actually create an isolated VLAN of your own and see how it works. Here's a really different slide. Maybe I should get out of the way. This is a slide I wanted to make sure everybody knew, because I got to be honest, a bunch of people at VMware didn't know, all the different things that you can use SRM for. I ran into a friend of mine yesterday or the day before. He's a professional services consultant. The last 3 SRM projects he did with customers were not DR. The last 3 projects he did all had SRM in them, and they were all right here, data center migrations. If you've ever done a data center migration, there's not a lot of testing. There's a lot of just winging it. Even if you have a great project plan, you're still winging it a little bit because it's hard to test. Well, when you use SRM to do the migration, and this fellow, Wade, was actually virtualizing physical machines, and there was already virtualized machines, and he was using SRM to test the migration, and then at the end of the testing, he just simply migrated. So test, 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 failover. So it's a great way to do migrations. I recommend it quite strongly, actually. What's another one? This is one I really like, disaster avoidance. Again, we don't advertise that. People don't talk about it too much. But I've had customers, the funny one is in New Zealand, they wanted to contribute to Earth Hour on Earth Day. So yes, it is funny actually. They actually did a press release too. They emptied their data center. I think it went to Singapore. So they failed their data center over so that for 1 hour they could say, we have nothing in use. There's no electricity in use in our data center. But it was running in Singapore, that's true. I think a more realistic use of this, and this is sort of a big deal, as funny as it is, I guess, but many of the customers I know, and I know a lot of customers, they've never had a bad thing happen that causes them to fail the whole data center over. But they've had a bunch of things as a group. A new UPS stuff coming in, a change in building power. Another one was a core network switch went down, and they figured it was only going to take 2 or 3 hours to fix, but they failed Exchange over to the other side. So they had a 15 or 20-minute outage, and Exchange was back. That 2-hour core switch outage took 12 hours to fix. But nobody really noticed it as much because they had their email. So disaster avoidance is a big deal. And at VMware, we're starting to think about that for our product development. Because often you'll hear about a storm coming, or you'll know that there's a power outage going to happen. I live in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and we had a bunch of oil guys come to town, and there was a lot of terrorism potential. And so people were being told to stay at home, work at home, avoid downtown. Well, that's a prime example where some people move things out to the airport where there's a lot of extra data centers, and that's actually where they worked. And they considered that a good DR test. It was overkill. It was a little more than they needed to do, but it was a great test of how SRM works and how their their employees can be a part of that. And then, of course, we've got the disaster recovery, the obvious. And here's a funny one. I've only seen one customer do it, but moving applications to QA. There's a customer that actually every night does a failover, fails over to a different environment that is used for QA, and then once it's failed over, he stops replication, then he turns everything back on in the production facility and just continues on, and then the next night he does it again. And if you think about it, those guys used to work a lot just to get 1 or 2 nights with production data. It was a lot of work, and now they test in the afternoon, and then at night they do a failover. But yet, after they fail over to the QA department, they turn everything back on. So it's sort of interesting. And I just wanted to mention this because I'm going to talk about how to be successful with SRM. But one of the things about being successful is understanding it can do more than one thing. All of these are very similar, but they deal with migration, they deal with movement. And if you can test, that's a good thing before you do it for real. If you have a history report of what all your testing and all your failovers were, that's a good thing, whether it be disaster recovery or disaster avoidance. Okay, here's the first of the 3 things that kill or make unbelievably expensive or make ever so painful SRM projects, and it's application. We had a project some time ago. There was no SRM at the time, but we put all of the customer put as much money into it as we wanted. We had our very best guys working on it, and we brought a lot of vendors in. So when we did all the work, and we were expecting a perfect test, and it was going to take 15 minutes, and we had everybody there, all the smartest guys, the test actually took 2 weeks. It was a disaster. We weren't recovering from a disaster, it became a disaster, because instead of 15 minutes, it was 2 hours. And what happened is an application didn't work. Because everything was manual, they didn't protect everything, they just protected their most important applications. And one of those most important applications didn't work, and they couldn't figure out why. We had to put a sniffer on the wire, we had to watch traffic and see what that application was looking for. And then when we found it, we had to go back and we had to replicate it across to the site and then do the test, and it worked. Once we knew that, the 15-minute failover took about 13 minutes. But it took 2 weeks when they didn't know what the application components were. So that's actually what we're talking about here. We're also talking about how you don't replicate everything. You don't replicate Active Directory. You put Active Directory on the other side. It can do odd things if you replicate it. You probably already know if you turn off a domain controller for a while and then turn it on later, sometimes it's a little confused, and that's what you do when you replicate it. So there are things you don't replicate. There are things you find on the other side when you start up, like Active Directory, sometimes DNS, sometimes antivirus. And I have an example down at the bottom here where it's talking about we can have an application that consists of a database server very likely, an application server, a web server. It uses the services of an Active Directory DC, and it uses DNS. So that's 5 virtual machines. I've had examples with SAP when I'm working with customers of 22 virtual machines. One app, 22 virtual machines. 22 or 21 is the number of Exchange servers at VMware. When we fail over our Exchange environment, there's actually 22 machines we have to fail over. And some of them are not logical. The managers that I chatted with, they thought it was 5 or 6 VMs somewhere. And it wasn't. It was a lot more. So what this is talking about here is knowing the components. In fact, I often say an application is the sum of its components. You need to know those components. If you don't, when you do a test failover, it will fail, and then you'll have to figure out what you're missing and do the test again. And you do that over and over until you get a successful test. It's the only way sometimes, doing it the long way, the hard way, if you don't know what the application is composed of. So really, really important. Here's a little more. Multi-tier apps are harder to protect, so they need extra attention and planning. I visited a customer that is a website customer. They have many of the world's children coming to their website on a very regular basis. An application there on the website is 14 levels deep. There's that many different levels of different apps. It's very hard to protect. And in point of fact, I had to say that SRM can't do it. Interesting, they bought it anyways, and it turns out there's 1 or 2 of those 14 levels that SRM can protect. But in fact, in the other levels, they had to do things like purchase load balancers and use global load balancing options. So I'm saying here multi-tier apps are important, and we can't protect the 14 that this website uses, but generally 7 or 8 layers are easy for us to protect. It just takes a design. It just takes you knowing about the 8 tiers. And again, I mentioned here an application is the sum of its parts. You really need to remember that. This can add in an extra week. If you're lucky, it can also add in an extra month, and I know cases where that's happened. 4 weeks of billable work. Or if you're not hiring anybody, just 4 weeks of your own. Can you afford to lose that? And I know I certainly can. This last thing is just something I was practically saying to myself while I was working on this. If you don't know the components of the application, how on earth can you protect it? It's true. Some things you replicate, some things you don't. Some things you use SRM, and some things you don't. So you really need to know the components. Incidentally, somebody there taking notes just made me think I forgot to mention something. In theory, somebody can correct me, this was available to you guys Sunday night. And I don't think I've ever seen that work, but probably Monday night or Tuesday night, something like that, you should be able to find this on vmworld.com. That is assuming if you can get to vmworld.com, because this morning I had some troubles with that. All of my slide decks are up there, and they're all current. And I don't think I need to change any of them, at least not in the few sessions I've done already. But if I do change them, I will get them up there. So that might mean you might want to wait towards the end of the week for sure. And my name are in all of these, so you guys should have my name. You can chase me if they're not up there. And the secret ones I do, so the SRM futures, those aren't going to be out there till the end of the week or something like that, but they will be up there. Business impact assessment. VMware in Palo Alto, that's where our head office is, we talk about this all the time. In real life, though, I've been to 40 or 50 customers in the last while, and not one of them had a business impact assessment. So when I say to you that this is a really big deal, this will help you with application knowledge, if you have a business impact assessment, you can turn the page until you hit Exchange. It'll tell you what all the components are. It'll tell you all who the people are to talk to about getting a design question answered or getting help. It'll have everything you need to make a very reliable recovery plan. But I did mention I haven't seen them in the real or in the wild. So what you're going to have to do generally is look at your old DR plans and see if there's anything in there. And I give you some ideas here. This one is particularly good. I've used this a number of times. Change control and configuration management. When I'm at a customer and they don't have a business impact assessment, and they said, here's our littlest app, this is the one we want to protect, and it doesn't work, because of course it's just 2 VMs. Sometimes, depending on the customer, I'll just go to the data center and say, hey, who's the guy that works late and turns things on and off? Let's go have lunch. And I'll talk to them and figure out who do they talk to, what machines do they turn on first and last, and I'll build up a picture. And then I'll go to configuration management or change control and do the same thing there, and then I'll see how those 2 things intersect. And then that'll be the information that often helps me figure out what goes into an application to make it work so that we can do a successful test. Again, SRM, very different app. When you do one successful test and your management is watching, often they'll get very excited because many of you have done DR work, I'm sure, and have you ever tested it? I've been on multi-million-dollar projects where we did DR and never, ever tested it. Maybe we tested components, but not everything. So when you can actually do a real test, people get excited, and they generally push you further and faster than you want to go. But that's why sometimes you end up talking to change control or configuration management so that you can actually get the information to do a good test. Here we talk about naming. It's sort of confusing, but one of the examples I'll give you is the SRM log. It has storage information in there, and it has VMware information in there. So the example is you have a LUN name and you have a data store name. Think to yourselves right now, are your LUN names and your data store names related in any way that's obvious? So somebody's nodding. That's a good thing, because usually they're not. Usually we have a storage naming scheme and we have a data store naming scheme, and they don't always match. And that means when you look, generally it doesn't cause you any issues because your storage guy isn't talking to your virtualization guy. They're both looking in their own world. But in SRM, it's one log file for both of them. So unless they're sitting side by side, it's a bit of a pain. So good naming really helps. And look at what we have on this little screen I have. Notice where it says protected apps? That's the only way, that folder, that's the only way in that lab for you to know what's protected when you look at vSphere. We can't change the icons to show protected or not protected status. We're working on it, but it's a lot harder than it sounds. And down here where it says recovery apps, I couldn't expand that, screen limitations, but that shows you the same names that you see up here. But they're not real VMs. They can't run. We call them placeholders. They're to remind you, literally to remind you, that when you do a failover in this folder right here, in this other virtual center, you're actually going to have running virtual machines that aren't normally there. So those placeholders are to remind you of that. But again, those placeholders, they got the same icon as these things up above. Again, like I said, we can't change the icons yet. Our model is just not right for that. So putting them into a folder that says protected apps and recovery apps really makes it a lot easier for you to understand. So again, just a little bit of help in the naming area to keep things clear will be very useful. This is number 2, by the way. So twice I've refused to sell a customer Site Recovery Manager, and once, one of those 2 times, they didn't listen to me and bought it anyways and just started on a year's project. But in both cases, the problem was simple. They had no storage organization. They had very large LUNs and hundreds of them. And they couldn't, it didn't matter what app, it didn't matter what VM, they had no idea what was stored where. If they bought SRM, all they could do would be to fail everything over in a crisis. They couldn't fail Exchange over, or Zimbra, or SharePoint. They could just fail the whole data center over, because they didn't know where everything was, so they would have to fail all of the LUNs over. And the amount of time it would take them to reorganize that would be, I figured, around a year or longer. So the moral of the story here, because it takes quite a lot for me to say we're not going to sell SRM to you, and that's a bad position, make no mistake, that's a bad position to be in. That company is legally mandated to have a DR plan. If the government went in to audit them, they'd be in deep trouble. So it's not a good position to be in to not have a DR plan or not be able to do a DR plan. What we're talking about here, what I recommend, is for your most important apps. You should know what LUNs they're using, and you should be organized. You should be able to say, you know what? Here are all the Exchange LUNs. Here are all the SharePoint LUNs. And then you have a recovery plan for SharePoint. You have a recovery plan for Exchange. And then in a disaster avoidance situation, you can say, I'm going to fail over Exchange and SharePoint, but nothing else. And of course, if you're in really deep trouble, you can actually say, I'm going to fail everything over. And then you just execute all of those recovery plans. And you get that possibility thanks to your storage organization. If every Exchange server is scattered across 100 different LUNs, well, you actually have to fail over all of those 100 LUNs. Does that make sense to everybody? Excellent. I already mentioned it once. I'm going to mention it again. We have a lot more small disasters with our customers. You know, I mentioned a core network switch. I mentioned the guys with the Earth Hour. Somebody had a water leak. And what they just do is move Exchange, or they move notes, and they just continue on. That is by far more common. That is what you have to plan for, not doing a data center-wide failover. Here's what this looks like from SRM's point of view. We have some LUNs over here. We can see the LUNs, and we have them organized. This one has SharePoint in it. This one has Exchange broken between the two of them, and SQL between these two LUNs. And so what happens is when you install SRM and you configure it, and you point it at LUNs, and we point it at this LUN right here, and we create a protection group called SharePoint, we also create a recovery plan called SharePoint. So if we just want to fail SharePoint over for a test or for real, we can run this recovery plan, and it only recovers SharePoint. However, that protection group in blue you can see up here as well. So in a really big crisis, or in the really big once-a-year failover that a bank might do, then they can run the recovery plan that covers off everything. And of course, if it comes time to audit, I get people auditing my work sometimes because they say what you did is just too easy. It can't work like that. And the audits, or the collection of historical information, is at the recovery plan point. So every time you run a recovery plan, we capture the status. We capture how long it took. We capture what worked or didn't work. We capture the error messages. So you can print out a recovery plan. It has a wonderful collection of what you need to know. Oh yeah, this would be number 3. And I think I've seen EMC and NetApp in the room. So in this area, I will say equal negative things about both of them and equal positive things about both of them. SRA is bad. 6 weeks I mentioned, this real-life example, a bank. They were implementing SRM. They had one of our brightest stars, Rob, working on it. And the SRA, the storage replication adapter, the interface between the storage and SRM, was a problematic beast. And it took an extra 6 weeks. Storage replication, if you remember, is the connection between, if you remember the diagram, between the storage and between SRM. And it does not support 100% of the features in your storage. You might have the $1 million storage replication solution, and the SRA for it might support 4 of the 152 features. And of course, I don't happen to remember what they are, because I have to remember 19 different SRAs, or 19 different companies, of which there is a lot more SRAs. I have some examples for you here. Mirror view. It requires snap view for testing, but it doesn't need snap view for doing a real failover. It can also only do one simultaneous recovery plan. Below it, that one's actually fixed, but below it, Recover Point could do a test but it could only accumulate or accept 40 gigabytes worth of changes. If you happen to be an Oracle shop and you have 4 users and 4 Oracle servers, it takes 4 days to accumulate 40 gigabytes of changes. And then, as you can imagine, what happens when a disk fills, the test stops. Hard and painful. That is fixed, thank goodness. Some SRAs actually require a LUN that's special and called a gatekeeper LUN. And you don't always know that in advance. The other one I like here is, do the SRAs support multiple recovery plans? I love doing 2 or 3 recovery plans at the same time. It speeds up the failover. But if the SRA doesn't support it, well, that might be something you need to know, because maybe you'll have to change the design of your disaster recovery. Oh, and here's another one that's very exciting. Man, I found this out the hard way. I'm at a customer site and we do a failover. It's the first time the customer's ever been able to do that, and they're a bank, so it's a pretty big deal, and we're all jumping around the room and excited. And the storage guy, he stops jumping dead, and he's looking, and the darn thing, as soon as we did a failover, the Hitachi started to replicate back. And it's not a good thing, because, of course, well, you know why. So we need to know that, so that, as an example now, when we do a proof of concept with Hitachi, and you look in the little cheat sheet we have, it says, watch out for this, and you tell the customer, hey, did you know? And, of course, they can do something to stop that. Some products can't stop that. So those you need to think of, and sometimes you pull a network cable or something like that, but you need to understand what needs to happen. So, as you can imagine, SRA is pretty exciting, but the important thing to know, as an example, like at the top there, we have the mirror view for Clarions. That's all you need to know. That and the README, of course, for more details, but what I mean is the SRAs are painful in the beginning, but once you've figured it out, once you've read the release notes and talked to somebody who's done it before, which I recommend strongly with any SRM project, talk with somebody else who's done it in the same way, then you'll know, and the SRA won't be scary or painful, and once you get through it, they generally don't cause you any issues. There's another one I thought I'd mention here. It's come up a couple of times. NetApp. We've gotten some complaints about NetApp and the account that you connect your storage array to the NetApp storage with. It needs to be an administrator account. And some of our customers that are in the military or in the government, they don't like using administrator accounts very much. And NetApp has produced a document that says how, with a fair bit of work, you don't have to use an administrator account. Now, if the customer had known that in advance, it took them 6 months to buy the darn thing, they could have done all that work with the SRA in advance, instead of slowing down the implementation that they were paying somebody else to do. So this stuff is not a secret. You look in the release notes of the SRA, you talk to people, and you get all the information you need to know, and then it's simple. And Andy here and I, we got some replication stuff going the other night as we were building things. Oh, the big red truck. You should go see the big red truck. We built a lot of stuff in it, including a real SRM test lab that's pretty cool. And we knew this stuff because I write it down every time I find it. So, it didn't work. I do this all the time, and that's right. When we set this up, the SRA hooped us. I do this for a living, and I still miss something that was in the README. Very embarrassing. Really, SRA is a problem. We're trying to make it better, but you need to read the README, you need to look at the release notes, and you need to be aware that even a fully functional SRA, let me give you a real-life example. We're using Dell EqualLogic in our truck. It really is a big red truck down on the floor, and we're using the Dell EqualLogic stuff, very nice. It does not support chat, authentication during a recovery. That's not in the README, it's not in the release notes, but through trial and error that was quite exhaustive, I confirmed that thing's following me. I confirmed that it's true. So that's another example. The SRAs are the bane of our existence. But you get them worked out, then they are fine ever after. Here's some things to talk or to think about for for performance. ESX 4.0 Update 1 had some amazing changes under the hood. I'm not even sure if we mentioned it in the release notes, but it deletes vswap files very quick. And that's important when you're doing a recovery because we delete them as part of the recovery. In addition, it simply searches iSCSI data stores much faster than we ever did before. So those are two things that make a recovery go faster. So again, that's why I say ESX 4.0 Update 1 or later is worthwhile to have on your recovery side from a performance of your failover. VMware tools, I had to explain this to somebody this morning. Generally, it takes approximately 3 minutes per VM to recover, maybe 4, maybe 5. It depends on your storage. But if you don't have VMware tools loaded, SRM will not be able to listen, will not be able to say, that VM just notified me that they're okay, and will continue on. And so there's 10 extra minutes added for a timeout per VM that doesn't have VMware tools loaded. You should have VMware tools loaded just to make your life as an administrator easier, but also performance and also for VMware. If you're using NFS, which a lot of people are, I'm quite fond of NFS, what we've discovered in our labs is you should have fewer and bigger, did I say that right? Fewer and bigger shares versus more and smaller, I guess. The recovery time is quite different between those two environments. Multiple simultaneous running recovery plans is a good thing to think about. What I didn't mention here is that we support all of our different storage. So we have 19 partners, as I recall, and they have a whole bunch of different SRAs between them. We support all of them at the same time. So I go to a company, I know a very large one in New York. They have 300 storage arrays, most of them from one vendor, and they have a few from another vendor. Well, it turns out we were able to use both storage platforms at the same time to replicate, and SRM could talk to both of them, so we were able to do 2 recovery plans at the same time, one on one storage vendor, one on the other storage vendor. So doing 2 recovery plans is better than 1, generally speaking. Now here's something that's a little confusing, so if I don't say it clear enough, I expect somebody to jump up and say, what the heck are you talking about? And it's right here, serial and parallel. When we recover virtual machines, high-priority virtual machines are recovered serially. You may have 40 ESX hosts on the recovery side. Some of our customers do. But we're still only going to recover 1 VM at a time. That's the definition of serial, I guess. But normal priority or low priority will do 2 at a minimum per ESX host at a time, up to 10 ESX hosts. So there's a really big difference there, but there's a real comparison difference, and that is with serial, you know exactly what order the virtual machines are going to start in. And in parallel, you know when the first 20, up to 20 are going to start, maybe, if you're lucky. But certainly not past that. You'll have no idea. Think about it. SQL servers, they take a lot longer to start than a web server does. And that's going to be what starts the order really going out of control. So that's important to know because that means when you look at your recovery virtual machines, and you might have 100 of them, or 10 for that matter, you want to have it go as quick as possible. And incidentally, that's the hard thing. SRM actually works really, really well. It's a great product for me to stand on a stage and tell everybody how cool it is because it really is not that hard to make work. What's a little harder, takes more effort, is making the 40-minute failover or the 8-hour failover go in 2 hours. That is where you put a lot of time and effort, and that's where you figure out what you really need to replicate or not. That's where you understand, do I want to do 2 simultaneous recovery plans or 3, as an example? But it also means you're not going to use serial in most cases. You're going to use parallel. But of course, when you're doing parallel failovers, there's often virtual machines that need to start at different times, and you need to control that. So I'm just mentioning at the end there that you can do it. You can design a solution that only uses parallel, but gives you the ability to control what starts when. And that's a design. And then, in fact, it's real simple. You have recovery plan 1 that starts all the virtual machines that need to start first. But because they're not related to each other, but because they're all just the ones that need to start first, you can start them all up under parallel. Then you have recovery plan 2 that starts the second tier virtual machines. And they're all not related, so you can start them all up in any order, but fast. So you can recover very, very much quicker using that sort of an idea than using serial. But you have serial just in case. That makes sense? I'm not going to talk about this slide. This is just where I put a little more information about what we just talked about. I like to have slide decks that you guys can look at next week or next month, and they still make sense. They're still useful. This is real important right here. This will be easier in the future. We have I forget when it is. Oh, might have actually been today. One of our developers is doing a presentation. Two of our developers. We probably should have went to that one, Andy. It would have been interesting, I bet. 2 developers doing a presentation together. It's called SRM Futures. It's playing again, and it's called Failback and More. And we actually have a much better way than this for our next major release, where you'll be able to control, first off, thousands of virtual machines being failed over in a very specific start order without any silliness like what I described here, having multiple recovery plans. So we have a really different model. Incidentally, there's 12 customers out there that we used as part of our interview process and our usability process, and those 12 customers helped us figure out a better way to do this. So I think I have a slide coming up that says if anybody wants to help us make SRM better, and there's an email address there. The fact is, well, first off, we give you $150 for helping us. Not a lot, but it's better than nothing. And you might be able to say next year, when I'm up here doing this next year, one of you might be able to stand up and say, that feature came from me. And I don't do that anymore, but I love to look at a feature that came from me and say to myself, hey, that's because I cared enough to say something. Anyways, last thing on the slide, really important. And it's sneaky and it's smart. You can take half of your protected applications and permanently move them to the other side. That way, if you ever have a disaster at one side or the other, you only lose half of your protected machines, and that automatically makes your failover much quicker. So it really helps. Not everybody can do that. There's sometimes political boundaries, or sometimes there's just reasons you can't. But if you can do this, this is a great thing to do. It will make a big difference in your failover time. Comprehensive testing. This is a really big category. It's really important to me. The more testing we do, the better things work. But the first thing is don't do any harm. I visited a customer a while back. I flew to a place I've never been before in Minnesota. Thank goodness it wasn't the winter. And that customer did a test once, not with SRM, but with in a mainframe environment. It was still a DR test. They had a networking error where 2 things were crossed. They had test data go into the production environment. That was a bunch of years ago, and as of last year, they still hadn't deleted it all, and they've paid more than $3 million to find and destroy that test data in their production environment. And I don't have time to tell you all the heartache they went through. And I've got to be careful to not give you too many clues because you could figure out who it is, I think.
Did you get the $3 million?
I did not, no. A bunch of consultants. Who else would get it, right? Consultants and lawyers get all the money. But I tell you, it is really, really important. I help customers set up tests where you can send and receive email. You can book appointment rooms. You can use Outlook Web Access to check things. And it's very realistic testing. In fact, it's so realistic, a bunch of our customers, that's how they now do patching. Because they're testing a patch in the middle of an SRM test on the real servers. Think about that for a moment. That's much better technically than doing a test on a net new machine in your lab. When you do a test of a patch on a net new machine, because the patches are layered in different order, it makes a big difference. Doing it in a test on the real thing is a big deal. But if you're in the middle of doing an SRM test, do you really want to have email that you are just testing out in the real world? Do you want to have the timestamps from your test sprinkled throughout your Active Directory world? There's no end of issues. So comprehensive testing using isolated VLANs is a great idea, but do not do any harm. RTO and RPO, here's a little bit of information about RTO and RPO. First off, we can handle with SRM any RPO that you want to pay for. I've been to customers who have 2 seconds, 3 seconds of RPO. Cost them a fortune, and we can work with it. However, we cannot handle any RTO. RTO is the amount of time between things breaking and things working. RTO, we're limited because we have to start virtual machines. I worked with this one company a while back. They had 2,800 protected virtual machines. We are never going to have a 15-minute cutover for those people. Never. So you've got to think about that. And the other thing that I didn't write down here, it's really, really important, is the RTO, let's pretend we've tested it and we know it works and it's 2 hours. You can never say to your management 2 hours. It's important. And you know why? Because your management is probably going to take, I would say 4 hours is a real good average, to decide to fail over. If you're lucky, and this sounds terrible, but if you're lucky and a tornado has just gone through your data center, then it might only take an hour to decide to do the failover. Well, no, I'm serious. This is what I do. There's a lot of customers out there I know a great deal about, and you have to add that 1 hour into the 2 hours. Even when you're behind a closed door and it's just you and your boss, every time you say you can do it in 2 hours, you have to say 2 hours plus whatever it takes you to decide to trigger the plan. Because I've seen this time and time again, where you guys do a bunch of work, I come back to visit and say, hey, this is awesome, and I'm having dinner with your CIO, and your CIO tells me, yeah, they got it down to 2 hours. And every time I say, well, does that include how long it takes you to decide? And then I say, how long would it take you to decide? And then the 2 hours turns into 5 hours. So just remember that. Also, things like I mentioned here, web servers start faster than SQL servers, so there's really a lot of variables. I like to suggest you do a real test and learn for yourself how long it'll take to start all those VMs. I think this is a little more of the same thing. Proof of concept, I strongly urge you to do a proof of concept, even if you've already purchased SRM and you've got the budget, you're about to implement it. I strongly urge you to do a proof of concept, get somebody else to host it, meaning hire somebody to come in and go through the proof of concept with you. It takes 3 days, and you will learn for yourself what I'm talking about the SRAs, how they can be hard in the beginning. Or you'll learn for yourself about your storage. You may not know how your storage is organized, and in that proof of concept where you go to protect one application, and you see what your storage is like, then you'll know. And then you can protect yourself and say to your boss, you know, it was just a proof of concept. It's going to be a little harder to do because, hey, our storage has an SRA that only supports 3 features and we need the 4th feature, or our storage is poor. So proof of concept's a good idea. Sometimes, a lot of the time, you can even get us to do them for free. I love doing them. And I like going to strange new places, just remember that. But you have to ask the local VMware person and say, Michael White, can he come out? And then I'll be happy to help. You can understand how that scales too, by the way. So we're just about finished. Here's a bunch of links. These are some really good links that'll help. There's one right here I want to draw your attention to, upgrading to SRM 4.1. I got to tell you the truth, it's a pain in the butt. And the reason is we finally broke down and decided to insist you use 64-bit operating systems. You should already be doing that. My customers 2 years ago were starting down the path of 64-bit. It's a lot easier for them. But if, in fact, you don't have 64-bit in your world, we're going to unfortunately force you to, and that makes the upgrade a little more difficult, a little more work. But I have pictures, no video, but I have pictures and detailed instructions in that URL to help. This evaluator's guide, I recommend it as well for your boss. Yes, question? Thank you for asking that question. I was not very clear there. SRM and Virtual Center at the 4.1 level require a 64-bit operating system to run. Not the guest. We'll still protect and recover DOS and Windows, for heaven's sakes. So here's some more links. EMC has some great documents and some great videos if you have EMC gear. They have so many features. They're sometimes a little hard to get going, but they have great support for you. Here's some more for HP. Hitachi's in there. We have a couple of other sessions I think you'll like. The host-based replication, I'm doing that with a developer. And host-based replication means you do not require storage arrays. You do not need storage arrays to replicate. We will replicate on your behalf between dissimilar storage arrays, between local storage, whatever you like, we'll do it. And screenshots. We're delivering this next year, middle of next year, but we have a really good presentation on that. And the failback and more, we have automated and simplified failback in the next release, and we have a brand new UI that's just, I think, very well done, and you'll see it in both of these. And I have a live demo kind of stuff in our truck. Here's our summary. And I think I have a request right here. We'd really appreciate your help to make SRM better. And that means if you email usability at VMware, we have this really nice lady. Her name's Olga. She's got a doctorate in UI research. Very smart lady. And she will help you to help us improve our user interface. And if you come to one of those presentations I just mentioned on the future, they do not look like SRM in any way, shape, or form. And that's as a result of us hiring this lady who's a researcher in UI and involving customers. We make prototypes and we get you to do the same actions in a couple of different prototypes, see what you think, see how it's hard or easy. And of course, after 10 people, we have a real good idea. After 15, we have another idea. So you can really be a big help to us. But this is really actually the last slide. Any questions at all? You shouldn't wait for the new version because today SRM does what I told you, and I can prove it in the big red truck, but it does a lot of cool things. The best I can say, because I don't really know, but I can tell you a lot of it is I've seen it. It's running. We've successfully passed internal milestones. So I'm thinking when I say the middle of next year, late summer, is probably reasonable.